Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Welcome back to the second video. So in this video we're going to look through difference in itself, the chapter on difference in itself. I've broken this up into two videos, so we'll go through the first one today, and we'll leave Plato we'll leave him for the second video next week, I guess, if you're watching this with me as I'm making them. So the first section in today's video is representation. So regarding representation, we talked about this a lot in the last video, but basically the problem is that difference has been mediated away. That's kind of what representation does. Mediates away difference to produce a kind of an organized, ordered whole, a harmonious organism is the expression that Deleuze uses. So this is characterized by things like I said, order, form, structure. All of the pieces fit in nicely. Everything fits in together under one overall overarching structural, overall overarching kind of structure. Framework fits into this framework coherently, tidily, and that's what representation does, and that's what Deleuze is wholly opposed to. The first form of this that we look at is organic representation, and this is basically representation which reduces reality to a finite system, which encapsulates reality in a whole that can be considered finite and complete, i.e. a kind of substance-based metaphysics. So representation mediates away difference. There are four aspects to reason as the medium of representation here. And interestingly, Deleuze calls this the fourfold root of reason, which I think you can't say the words fourfold root without thinking of Schopenhauer, right? And he also calls them a bit more leadingly the four shackles of mediation. So that kind of tells you where his mind is regarding these. Anyway, the four aspects here, they are identity, analogy, opposition, and resemblance. And we're going to see those crop up later, and we'll discuss them in more detail later. But for now, I'll just go through briefly what each one is. The identity refers to identity of the concept, and this appears in the form of the undetermined concept. Analogy is the analogy of judgment, and this comes across in the relation between ultimate determinable concepts. The opposition is the opposition of predicates, and this arises in the relation between determinations within concepts. And just a note on this, opposition, different from the others, right? So identity, analogy, resemblance, and opposition. Opposition's a little bit different. So it sounds different because it seems like it embodies difference, right? Opposition is difference. The difference of two things are two things which oppose each other. This is kind of this crops up every once in a while in Deleuze. I think there's a sense of Leibniz comes through here. So if you think of Leibniz, whose totality and infinity was all about preserving the alterity of the other, keeping the other at a distance from the self, and the reason was that if the negator and the negated are posited together, they form a system. That is to say, they form a totality. They form a unity, a whole which is identical with itself. And that is exactly what Deleuze is against, right? Identity. He's looking to preserve difference. So although opposition sounds on its face like a form of difference, or like it embodies difference, in actuality, anytime you oppose two things, oppose one thing with another, you are uniting them. You're bringing them together in a totality, in an identical whole. And that, in that sense, opposition always leads away from difference. It always mediates difference. So there was opposition, and the last one was resemblance, which is resemblance of perception, and this occurs in the determined object of the concept itself. So those are the four shackles of mediation. What's important about those as well, another thing that's important about those is each one has some kind of each one refers to determine in some way, the word determine. Identity is the determined concept. Analogy, the determinable concept. Relations between determinable concepts. Opposition, relations between determinations within concepts, and resemblance in the determined object of the concept. So, and that word determine will become important later as well. So I just want to point that out. We won't go into it in any detail just here, but that's coming. But those are anyway the fourfold root of, or that is the fourfold root of representation. Okay, let's look to the next section, which is being. Okay, so being. I should mention as well that these kinds of subdivisions that I'm breaking up this chapter into, they're not Deleuze's subdivisions. They're not his headings, subheadings, or whatever. I'm just trying to bring some order to the chapter, I guess, which contra to everything that Deleuze stands for. I'm trying to organize this chapter in some kind of coherent fashion for myself so that it just makes sense for me. But yeah, so just in case you're wondering, where's he getting these different, how's he breaking up the chapter? It's just the way that I'm trying to do it to so that I can make sense of it myself. So anyway, being. Deleuze starts by saying that there has only ever been one ontological proposition. Being is univocal. So being is the same. It's always said in the same way. It always refers to the same thing. It's said in the same sense for all modalities. So even though being might appear in different ways, it might take on different forms, all of these different forms, these modalities of being, they refer back to this univocal idea of being. But what Deleuze says is that's not the right way to think about this. All of these different modalities of being are not the same. And so, and they're irreducibly not the same. They can't be equalized. They can't be reduced to this single univocal idea called being. So for him, the essence of being then must include within it these individuating differences, these differences that make these different things appear different or be different. And that's kind of an important idea. Being, the essence of being includes difference. That's essentially what he's saying. So if we think about being, what is, what exists, we tend to reduce it ultimately to one thing. And that's the word being. That's why it's univocal. And like clay, my example is clay. If we think of being as clay, it can be molded into different shapes, but each shape is still fundamentally the same clay. It's the same stuff. And what Deleuze is saying is that's the completely wrong picture. That's the wrong way to think about being. There is no underlying clay that remains the same throughout all of these different modalities, throughout all of these different manifestations that being can take. And that means that for him, being is not a genus. So we can't think of being in terms of a genus which encapsulates a number of different species. We can't think of it as a category within which there are a number of smaller subcategories. It's not a genus like this. And then the reason is that, and I really like this phrasing, being is the possibility of being for specific differences. Being is the possibility of being for specific differences. So being's not a thing. And we often think of it in terms of a substance. This is obviously going to be some kind of, well, not obviously, but maybe a non-physical kind of substance, some kind of metaphysical substance or whatever. But it's going to be substantial in some way, in the sense that it's the same. It's always the same thing, and it can be molded into different forms, but it's always the same thing, always the same entity, being. But what Deleuze is saying is that's the wrong way to think about it. It's not any kind of thing. Rather, it is a possibility of being. It's a possibility of difference coming into being. That's what being is. It's this possibility that difference can arise in these particular forms. That difference can exist in these particular specific instances. So I quite like that expression. Being is the possibility of being for specific differences. And it just flips the whole discussion. Now, instead of thinking of being as an invariant thing underneath these changes, underneath the differences, we've flipped it. Now we're thinking of being as the difference underneath the appearances. So the difference is the thing that exists. Differences are the truth, if you like, the essence of reality, and the possibility that they can come about. That's what being is. Being is it's like the instantiation, in a way, of these differences. So that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, and quite nice, quite enlightening, I think. There's something insightful about that. So it's just really against thinking of being as an invariant metaphysical substance or a category which subsists underneath difference. It's just changing the way that we approach that, we think about it. And for Deleuze, there are three principal moments in the history of the elaboration of this univocity of being. The first is Duns Scotus. So for Scotus, being was univocal, but it was neutral, indifferent. It had no impetus to it. Being was just this, it was the clay that didn't care either way. It had no drive of its own. And he neutralized being as an abstract concept then. So Deleuze glosses this by saying being, for Scotus, being is thought. The second moment in this history is Spinoza. And for him, also being is univocal, but instead of being neutral, being is an object of pure affirmation. So it's now coloured, I guess. It now has some skin in the game, if you like. There's a sense of direction to it, purpose. And for Spinoza, Its being is identical with substance, nature, God, all words that mean the same thing for him. But this means that Deleuze can gloss this by saying being for Spinoza is affirmed. And then we come to Nietzsche. And for him, for Deleuze anyway, Nietzsche enacts a Copernican revolution with his notion of the eternal return. And perhaps before we even get into this, Nietzsche's doctrine of and that's putting too much on it, I think. This notion of eternal recurrence is, it was just a test offered to see if you really love life, to see if you really embrace life and everything that it has to offer, all the goods, but all the bads as well. And so, all the good, but all the bad as well. And so if you can say, so he said, this is the test. Imagine that your life was going to repeat such that every single thing that has happened to you and every single thing that you did will happen again, and you will do again forever. Imagine that situation. If you knew that in advance, would you still say yes to life? Would you still accept life? Or would you run screaming in the other direction and say, that's it for me, I'm out, punch my card, I'm done? Because if you would say yes, I want it all of that, all of the highs, but all of the lows as well, all of the good stuff, but all of the bad stuff as well. If you say yes, you want all of that, then you have passed the test. You love life. You're committed. You're passionate about life. If you say no, then you don't deserve life in the first place. You've failed Nietzsche's test. So that's how Nietzsche envisaged his eternal return. And to me, Deleuze's version of this has absolutely nothing to do with that. Almost nothing, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a bad thing if you don't know anything about Nietzsche and you're reading Deleuze, because you'll get the completely wrong opinion, I think, of Nietzsche and his philosophy. So despite the fact that Deleuze, and he portrays Nietzsche's eternal return as the way that he as this kind of completely distorted picture of how Nietzsche thought of it. I think if Nietzsche read Deleuze's impression of his eternal return, he wouldn't even recognize it. But again, that's only a problem if you are kind of a purist about the idea. And it is kind of a problem, I think, because he's really presenting Nietzsche in a false light. It's not what Nietzsche thought of his eternal return. It's perhaps an extension of it, maybe, if we're being generous to Deleuze. But man, it's an extension that's so far removed from what Nietzsche had ever envisaged. Which again doesn't detract from the way that Deleuze uses it. And if he kind of didn't portray it so strongly as being Nietzsche's thought, Nietzsche's idea, I wouldn't have anything to say about it. But anyway, I just mention it. Every time I talk about Nietzsche's eternal return and Deleuze, I'm talking about Deleuze's eternal return, actually, not Nietzsche's. But that's the way that Deleuze talks about it, as if this was all straight from the mouth of Nietzsche. So anyway, Nietzsche enacted this Copernican revolution with his eternal return, and for Deleuze, the way Deleuze puts it is that or in his version of the eternal return, identity is a secondary principle which revolves around the different, which is the primary principle. And so this is the flip. This is the change in thought. Instead of identity being on the side of being, where it is either thought, conceptualized, or where it's identified as substance and affirmed, being for Nietzsche here is different. It's the different. It's difference itself rather than identity. Identity comes along as a secondary principle. But what's the real essence of being here in the eternal return is the different. And the idea behind this is that being is the return itself. Being is the movement of return, not what's actually being, not what's actually being recycled, if you like, not what's coming back to you, not the contents. Being is not that. Being is not the clay that's being molded. Being is the molding of the clay. Yeah, that's the way to think about this, actually. That links back to that analogy. Instead of being as the clay, which is the substance, being here in this picture is the molding of that substance. That's what being is. And so Deleuze adds this, which again I never read in Nietzsche. So if it's there, I completely missed it. But he says that the return presupposes that all previous identities have been abolished and dissolved. So whatever comes back is coming back in a sense for the first time. It's because all prior identities have been eliminated, abolished. So like I say, liberal interpretation of Nietzsche's eternal return, but it stands if you don't connect it, if you don't try and connect it back to Nietzsche too strongly, too closely. So being's the return itself, nice. And that means then that being as the return is becoming. Being is like I said, the molding, it's the process. Then being is actually becoming, i.e. change, movement, a process. In other words, being is primarily difference. That's just another way of saying the same thing. If being is becoming, then being is difference, because no two becomings are the same. There's always difference involved in them, even if that difference is just that this particular iteration has already happened. You're adding to it. Then there's difference embodied in that. And that's straight out of Bergson, by the way. I remember saying exactly the same thing in the video I made on one of the videos I made on Bergson anyway. But that's the idea, the basic core of Deleuze's take on the eternal return. So the same, actually, I'm not finished though. So the same or the identical in the eternal return is the fact of the return, which is itself difference. So there's still a sense in which we can say, which we can think of the return under the aegis of the same or identity. But what's identical in it is not what comes back, but the very fact that the return happens at all. That's what's the same. So what's being replicated, what's being reproduced is not the same. It's difference itself in the return, in the eternal return. And it's in this sense that the return considered as the same or identical is secondary to the return considered as difference, which is primary. So being is still kind of, in a sense, being can still be thought of as being spoken of univocally with the same sense, but it's just that the same in this way of thinking about it is the return itself, i.e. difference. Difference is the same. And basically, I think what's going on here is where there's a change in thinking from thinking about content to structure. You've got to be careful with using the word structure because, like I said, structure is very much associated with representation, the elimination of difference. But I think if you take it in the right way, this makes sense. Or maybe we could say the changes from thinking of in terms of empirical content to metaphysical structure. It's just like stepping back and grasping reality itself, grasping what's happening, rather than trying to make reality conform to our perspective within it. So stepping back and trying to form a metaphysical picture here. And when you do that, then you can see that this return of events, of experiences, is actually what's the same in this, what's univocal about this, is the fact of the return, the fact that process keeps happening. And what that process is, though, is essentially difference. It's always it's always changing. It's always chaotic. It's always movement. But again, we can think of it. We can understand that in terms of identity, in a secondary sense, through thinking about it, the process itself. Okay, I better stop there because man, you can just get sucked into a black hole of explication with that. Anyway, so what the way Deleuze glosses this is to say that being is realized in Nietzsche. In the eternal return, anyway. So essentially, these three principal moments, we've gone from Scotus to Spinoza to Nietzsche, and basically going from, so at each point, Deleuze talked about them. Being is thought for Scotus, it's affirmed for Spinoza, and it's realized in Nietzsche. So we're really going through like a concept, starting with concept, moving to an affirmation of something which pre-exists, though, something pre-existing, something substantial, which is always there, eternal in a sense. Not in a sense, eternal. And then to creation or production through the return. So the return is a process of creation. And in that sense, being is realized through that. Okay, let's turn now to the infinitely small and the infinitely large. So up until now, we've kind of looked at ways that difference has been mediated away, eliminated by what Deleuze calls organic representation, which I think is basically finite, a finite approach to eliminating difference. And by finite, I just mean taking being to be this invariant thing, something that we can kind of, it's a certain amount of clay, a finite amount of clay. That's what being is. And in that sense, it's finite, and that is what Deleuze calls organic representation. But now we turn to the infinite, so attempts to mediate difference through the infinite, which Deleuze calls orgiastic representation. And there are two ways that Deleuze recounts here. The first is the infinitely large, and the second is the infinitely small, obviously. So the infinitely large is Hegel, comes in with Hegel and his notion of the absolute. And what Hegel does, Deleuze says, is he begins with the essence as genus. And a genus which contains the species. So you've got a whole which contains the other. The other is not actually a real other. The other is a part of this whole, a part of this genus. The other is a species that fits into this genus, that can, although appear as other, can appear as different from other species, actually fits into this broader genus. It fits into this bigger, more encompassing unity, identity. And so that's where Hegel begins, with the essence of this genus, so that it can contain all of the apparent differences. And that way it mediates the differences, gets rid of them. And that's the absolute. So he takes situations to the absolute maximum of difference, i.e. contradiction. So you get two opposing pairs, and then he resolves these by relating them to a ground, a bigger, more, a bigger, well, to use the word we're using, genus, which encompasses them both. So it's thinking of reality in terms of genus, species, in terms of wholes and parts, so that you eventually get to one whole that encompasses everything, that completely overrides any difference that you thought you detected. So through mediation, he says, Hegel creates movement, but it's a false movement because it's a movement of words and concepts. And I really like that idea. That really resonates quite strongly with me. I don't know why, but I feel like I have a real acute allergy almost to this kind of movement, this kind of way of philosophizing, which is very analytic. It's very, very much the analytic style of philosophy, which is why I've invested virtually no effort in that direction, into analytic philosophy. Because it's just whenever you get into it, you invest the effort to understand what it is that whoever it is you're reading is talking about, and then when you're finished, you think, okay, what does this relate to? What does this actually mean? And you realize it doesn't mean anything, because what's happened is, if you've got reality here, you've kind of separated yourself through this analytic process. You've created a model, a representation, and then all of the work has been done, all of the philosophizing that's been done has been done within this model, within the representation. It's all concepts and definitions and jiggling and juggling around the terms, and it's all coherent. It's internally coherent, right? There's nothing you can't point to anything in analytic philosophy that's incoherent or that's contradictory. But when you're finished, reality's over here and you're over here. There's just no connection between the two. And that's how I feel when whenever I spend any too much time kind of drifting into across to the wrong side of the tracks of philosophy, into that analytic camp. And I was thinking about this. It's a little bit like fantasy writing for philosophers, because if you think about something like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien created an entire separate world full of different peoples and races and languages and customs and traditions, and it all makes sense within that world, but it has absolutely nothing to do with reality. And so then that's kind of the analogy I draw here, is that analytic philosophy taken to an extreme ends up just separating itself with this representation that they then invest all of their time into. without stopping to think, this is not actually reality. Are we describing reality anymore? And I actually feel the same about physics, and I've written about this many times. I always complain about it to you guys, but I think like mathematical models of reality, there's an inbuilt limitation there, because although they do have practical applications, and there are obvious cases where models have revealed certain things about the world, but there is a point where you go too far, and in trying to play with the model, you think you're doing something to the real world, but you aren't anymore. And I'm thinking here of things like, sometimes you hear physicists say things like, the universe or reality is a mathematical shape or something. That's Max Tegmark. Or I think Sean Carroll said this once. I love Sean Carroll. I love Max Tegmark as well, but so it's not I'm not criticizing those guys specifically, but I guess I kind of am, but I'm not maligning them in any way. Just this idea that, and what Carroll, I think it was Carroll said, the universe is the Schrodinger equation. It's like, that doesn't make any sense on any level. How can the universe be a mathematical equation? But that's what happens when you spend too much time thinking about the model and you've divorced yourself from reality. So to rewind this right back to somewhere where I got off track, Hegel creates movement, but it's false movement because it's a movement of words, concepts, and ultimately it has no connection with reality, metaphysical reality. And so that's metaphysical reality is still reality. It's just the foundations of reality. So anyway, stop. Enough. For Hegel, the notion of the absolute then yields a synthetic identity. So you're taking separate parts and unifying them in a greater whole. As opposed to Leibniz and the infinitely small, where we're talking about his monads, his concept of the monad. And so what Leibniz does then, in contrast to Hegel, who began with the essence as genus, Leibniz begins with the inessential. And by this, Deleuze doesn't mean unnecessary, but he means that the inessential in the sense that the other is not incorporated into an identity essentially. It's not incorporated into an essential identity, i.e. an identity greater than the two parts, the two smaller entities. It's not encompassed. It's not incorporated by an encompassing genus, because that's what the essence does for Hegel. The essence of this genus unites those two different things. Leibniz isn't doing that. He's not achieving identity in the same way, because he's not doing that, he's doing the opposite of Hegel. Hegel was starting with essence. Leibniz is starting, therefore, with inessence, the inessential. And that, what that means is that Leibniz is starting with specific properties in specific cases. So we're looking at the things themselves broken apart, the details of specific things. And we're still getting unity, though. Leibniz is still deriving unity or identity from this through what Deleuze calls subsumption under cases. So the way I see this is that you've got all these different monads, but there are these similarities. There are points of overlapping between the monads, and it's that which connects them. It's that which allows us to put them together in a greater whole. And because this is the opposite of Hegel's approach, and Hegel's approach was taking situations to the absolute maximum of difference with contradiction, which he then resolved. Deleuze calls what Leibniz does, since there's no word for it, the opposite of this taking two things as contradictory and then mediating the difference. Deleuze calls it vice diction. Vice diction. So vice diction is achieving identity through subsumption under cases, by looking at specifics rather than, it's kind of by going down into the details rather than stepping back and trying to fit everything into a bigger picture. That's the essential idea, I think, there. So the notion of monads yields, in contrast to Hegel, which was a synthetic identity, the notion of monads yields an analytic identity. And analytic, whenever I think of that, analysis, I always think of breaking apart, tearing something down, breaking things up into parts and looking at the details, the detritus of that, as opposed to synthesis, which is kind of stepping back and fitting things into a bigger picture. Okay, so that's orgiastic representation. And it must be time to move into the last section, which is negation. So negation has nothing to do with difference. Negation is the exact opposite of what Deleuze is going on about. The negative is the image of difference, but a flattened and inverted image. Negation is difference, but difference seen from its underside, seen from below, seen the right way up, from top to bottom. Difference is affirmation. So this is a really nice, short encapsulation of this idea. Again, worth pointing out because it's so rare that you get these little gems of crystal, of clarity, I should say. And after wading through pages of virtually impenetrable text, you come across these little gems. And it's a nice metaphor too, right? So difference seen from the bottom, from an inverted perspective, is negative. So it looks to be negative. When you think about difference, right, you do think negative. This is not that. It's kind of a natural way of thinking. But like we saw before at the beginning when I talked about opposition, anytime you think in terms of negation, you're negating something with something else or against something else, and then you're bringing them together, that means, into a totality. Back to Levinas. You're bringing them together into a unity, an identity, sameness. And that's the exact word that Levinas uses, the same. And so that's not going to work then for Deleuze. What's central for Deleuze is that difference be an affirmation. It must be purely and entirely positive. In itself, it has to be considered in itself, on its own, as a unique, standalone individual. It has to be that's how we have to think of these things that are different from others. Difference, it can't be different in relation to, because that means you're invoking this. You're saying that this is not that, and that's the basis on which this is different, by which this is different from that. And as soon as you do that, then you're bringing them together. You're thinking in terms of a totality. And yeah, it's crucial for Deleuze to understand Deleuze that difference is difference in itself. That's why he calls this chapter difference in itself. It's not different in relation to other things. And that gives you affirmation. Difference is an affirmation of this thing, of this being, whatever it is. It's not, it has no kind of, it's not borrowing any of its vitality from its difference in relation to something else. And so the large and the small, the infinitely large and the infinitely small, are negations of opposition and limitation, respectively. So the large is a negation of opposition, in the sense that you've got two concepts opposed to each other, which then find synthesis, which are then mediated into this totality, into a harmonious whole. And the small is a negation of limitation. And I think because here you are shrinking yourself down, you're locking yourself in monads, which are then subsumed under specific cases where you're identifying points of similarity between different monads. And so both of these, the infinitely large and the infinitely small, achieve their unity, achieve identity through negation. And that tells you that this is the exact opposite of what Deleuze is about. And then he goes on to talk about two conceptions of the affirmation-negation relation. The first is the poet. So the poet, for Deleuze, affirms difference and a permanent revolution. I don't really love that kind of way of thinking of things, but it's probably one of the reasons I didn't like Anti-Oedipus. But yeah, that's a permanent revolution. And from a metaphysical perspective, I guess you can think of it as what I was just saying before: difference in itself. It's not tethering itself to other things. It's not proclaiming its difference as a difference from that or this. It's a revolt against those things. It's not. And even that, if you say it wrong, you can think of, well, how can you have a revolt except a revolt against other things? But it's a revolution without anything to revolt against. It's just this surging, this impetus of affirmation, completely in itself. So the poet affirms difference in this permanent revolution, which is imbued with creative power. Really nice words that really capture Deleuze's project. And the main idea here is that affirmation is the driving force. Difference is primary. Affirmation affirms difference and distance. It affirms that difference without tethering itself to other things. Just affirms itself, its difference, again, in itself. I can't stress that enough. And difference here then is light, aerial, and affirmative. That's how Deleuze characterizes this. So you get this, you get a no from difference. Difference still, even though we're talking about how difference is pure affirmation, we're getting this, we do get a no from difference, but it's a no that arises out of affirmation. It's a no that arises out of the thing being the thing itself, the thing being its own thing. It says no to being brought under a system of rules or a system of laws that connect it to other things. It says no to being subsumed under any kind of identity or into any kind of totality with other things. So it's a no that refuses that any form of identity. It's this, and there's your permanent revolution, right? But it's a no that comes from affirmation, not from negation. And then you have the politician, the other conception of this affirmation-negation relation. The politician, ever the enemy, right? The politician it represents a conservative denial of the different in order to preserve the established historical order. And here, negation is the driving force. So the whole point of the politician here is to prevent difference, to maintain the status quo, to maintain harmony, to bring everything together into a cohesive, harmonious totality. And that means that its main drive is to negate. And what is it negating? Difference. So this can produce an affirmation again, or not again. This can also produce an affirmation, but it's an affirmation that affirms negation. It affirms the same. It affirms no change. And in that sense, it's affirming that negative. And so, in actuality, it doesn't matter whether we see or we hear a yes or a no. What matters is where those responses come from. Do they come from difference? That is to say, do they come from a positive affirmation, or do they come from negation? So something which is striving to maintain the same, to preserve unity and identity. And to that end, Deleuze refers to Nietzsche, who opposes both the yes and the no of the ass, to the yes and the no of Dionysus Zarathustra. So it's not as superficial as someone saying yes. Are they promoting kind of a forward positive direction, or are they affirming, or are they denying something? Are they negating? That's the superficial level, because it doesn't matter whether it's a yes or a no. What matters is where that yes or no come from. What's the motivation behind them? Is it a motivation from difference, which is the powerful, creative, affirmative force of Deleuze, or is it that negative, inward, contracting sameness coming from a source of sameness, of identity? In which case, it's negative, whether it is superficially a no or a yes. Okay, let me finish there. So that's us for today. We must be up for a summary then. So first we looked at representation. The basic idea, representation mediates away all difference. It looks to eliminate it, looks to equalize everything, bring everything together into a harmonious whole. And we talked about the fourfold root of representation, and that included identity, analogy, opposition, and resemblance. Then we looked at being, and the insight here was that the essence of being includes individuating differences. So being can't be some kind of fixed, invariant substance. And that nice expression, being is the possibility of being for specific differences. So it's not a thing. Yeah, that's what I just keep coming back to with this. It's not a metaphysical entity. It's not a metaphysical thing. It is this the possibility of being for difference, which means that it's not a genus. So we're not thinking in terms of genus and species. We're not thinking in terms of broader categories which include and bring together harmoniously subcategories of things. Being is not that kind of thing. And we traced the three moments in the history of the thought of being to Scotus, which was thought, Spinoza, where being was affirmed, and Nietzsche, where being was realized. And in Nietzsche, that's where we get the Copernican revolution, where being is seen as the return itself. Being is difference. It's becoming. It goes from, and so in this track, this path, it goes from concept to substance to being created, to a creative endeavor, to being realized, created in the return. Then we looked at the infinitely large and the infinitely small, so eliminating difference here through subsuming the finite under the infinite. And this was what Deleuze called orgiastic representation, to contrast with finite methods of eliminating difference, which were organic representation. And the two kinds here, the infinitely large, we saw come through with Hegel, through his notion of the absolute, and this yielded a synthetic identity. Hegel starts with the essence, thinks in terms of genus and species, mediates differences. So you get a contradiction between two things, which is then mediated into the essence of the genus. And the infinitely small came through with Leibniz and his notion of the monad. This yielded us an analytic identity, and everything's the opposite of Hegel. So instead of the essence, we're dealing with the inessential here. And instead of achieving identity through contradiction, Deleuze has to make up a word for this because there is no word, and the word that he chooses is vice diction. And finally, we looked at negation. Basically, this has nothing to do with difference. Negation is difference. It's the image of difference, but a flattened and inverted image. Difference is always an affirmation, never a negation. To negate something is to place it into, is to bring it into relation with something, to totalize it, to bring it under a single concept, to turn it into identity. And we looked at the yes and the no of the ass versus the yes and the no of Dionysus Zarathustra. The idea being there that it doesn't matter whether you get a yes or a no, whether you get an affirmation or a negation on the surface. What matters is where those things come from, where those responses come from. Do they come from difference, in which case they are affirmation, even if superficially we're saying no, or do they come from a place of negation, affirming the same, in which case it's negation, whether on the surface it's yes or no. All right, so that's us today. I was debating about whether to do this chapter in 1 or 2 videos. I'm really glad I decided to do it in 2. On paper, I thought I could get through it much faster, but you never get through these things as fast as you think you're going to. Well, I don't anyway. So yeah, we'll finish up this chapter in the next video. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll catch you in the next one.